Hey, everybody. This is Pulp Christian. I'm Dave.
I'm Tyler.
This is the podcast where we read some stuff from Facebook.
And
talk about it.
And Twitter about it. I'm Tyler, as I already said.
You're Tyler.
Hey, here's something for you.
Okay.
T-shirts are in. I just got a text from my old battle axe, and she says that... she said via picture that the T-shirts are here, so they should be, at least I got mine shipped to me today, so I'm sure all y'all will get yours today, too, if you went through speedy delivery, just like I did. So, there's that. And what else is new?
Half the country has had bricks thrown through it.
We're not going to talk directly about that, but maybe indirectly today. We do have some... We just respond directly to questions that are asked, and so I did handpick some questions. And here's the first one.
All right, let's have it.
All right, Liam asked, how is the Bible viewed as a blueprint for morals when it promotes / condones slavery?
That's a good question.
I did some research on this because I didn't totally know. I mean, I had some ideas. I'd heard things in sermons, but I just wanted to research it. So there's actually a really good article by Arzim. That's Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
He's dead now.
They're not a sponsor, but...
He died.
Probably not going to be a sponsor after you said that.
Yeah.
There's a really good article by Brandon Cleaver. Look it up. It's... anyways, he talks about how the Hebrew word that is often translated as slave in the Old Testament, obviously a lot of us know, but it means servant. And in the Old Testament, in the Levitical law, it was like a 7-year contract that was often used. It was volunteer. I mean, it wasn't like you just stole people like the U.S. did, but it was volunteer to pay off debt and stuff like that. Okay,
so the word means... in the New Testament, isn't it bond servant?
Yeah, yeah. When it's like talking to Christians and saying like we are slaves of Christ or servants of Christ, it's the word bond servant, which is like a voluntary servitude.
It's like a contract. Yeah. Basically, it's like if you owe a debt that you can't pay to somebody, you say, I'll work for you for however long until I pay off what I owe you. And then depending on, let's say the dude you're working for treats you really well. After you've paid him off, you can decide to be like, I just want to work for you forever.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to do that because I actually like working for you.
So you get your ears pierced.
Yeah, and then they took like an awl, which is basically like a big nail, kind of like a big fat nail, and they punched a hole in your ear.
It's like the first person with gauges.
Yeah, and that was kind of like, I don't know, getting your slave ticket punched.
Maybe servant ticket punched.
Servant ticket, there you go.
Yeah, the word itself, it's hard in the English when you say slave, you say it from an American context and not like...
Right.
And with all of its sort of, culturally and racially charged meaning, but that's not how the Bible necessarily means it. In fact, in Exodus 21, it says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death.
Dang.
So it's not like anyone who was using the Bible as a reason to have slaves in the pre-Civil War South, that was obviously taking things way out of context. It says in Exodus 21 also, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. And then in Deuteronomy it says, you must supply them generously from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. The Lord as God has blessed you. You must give to them. So it's like, not only does he work for you, but you pay him when he leaves. So it's like he's somebody who's down and out, and you're getting him on his feet again, is the idea.
Yeah.
So, and then just real fast in Leviticus, it says, they are to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly.
Also, 1 Timothy 1:10 says, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine, basically will not inherit the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. Yeah, slave traders.
Yeah, they're in the list of people who are going to get their butts spanked.
As bad as homosexuals.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Yeah, one thing I was reading and is mentioned in that same article is that back in the...
Do you think a gay slave trader is worse than
they go to double
one?
hell?
Yeah. He's like, these men are mine now.
Hell too.
I apologize. It's very hot out today.
Yeah. Have you lost all sound, mind, and...
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I might have.
Well, take a swig of your mango LaCroix and get yourself... Well, one thing I was reading in this article, he said that there was a lot of New Testament justification for slaves, and in fact they would bring slaves in pre-Civil War South to church and then read them like the verse in Ephesians 6, bondservants, or probably use the translation slaves, which is in some translations, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, ... as you would Christ. So there's this command for slaves.
They would leave out the part where it says, masters, treat your slaves well.
Right.
So what does the whole verse say?
The rest of it says, masters, do the same to them. Stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So obviously the message there is you are the same creation as your slave. Yeah, they conveniently leave that part out. So the idea is, they were using this verse as justification, but leaving that part out. And then they also use Philemon. Are you familiar with that book?
You mean Philemon?
If you like.
Yeah, I've read it.
I read it.
I've read it a time or two.
Before I tell you what they were using as justification, what's your overall how do you, with no sort of motive to keep slaves, what's your overall summary of that book?
Of Philemon?
Yeah.
It's interesting because Paul starts the book by calling himself a slave.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is slave of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So
subtle dig.
It seems like Paul is basically saying, look, if this guy harmed you in any way, or if he owes you anything, I will pay his debt.
Yeah.
Like his financial debt.
Right.
And he's basically equating him as a brother,
mm-hmm.
as someone who is their equal, and asking Philemon to forgive this man.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part where he's like, he was formerly useless to you, which maybe that meant he was lazy, or maybe I don't know what it meant.
Mm-hmm.
But it says now he's useful to both of us.
Yeah, because I guess we didn't say this yet, but Onesimus became a Christian, and so Paul, people will use this to say that Paul is not. He should have used this book as an opportunity to condemn slavery because he ended up with the slave of a Christian. And so he should have, you would expect Paul to then condemn slavery because a Christian had a slave or whatever. But obviously the first thing is that they misunderstand what the word slave means. Second of all, he basically did do that. He just did it in a Christian way, which is hey, if he owes you anything, charge it to me. And by the way, you owe me your life because I preached the gospel to you and you would be dead in your sin without me. So it's ... Right. Let the dude go. Obviously.
He's being shrewd.
Yeah. He's being really, shrewd. Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like that's a completely different scenario than like the South.
Right.
Because in the South, they weren't even thought of as humans. Like the whole, have you heard of it's a pseudoscience, but phrenology?
Is that the study of the cranium?
Yeah. It's a study of like your skull, basically. And it's a farce. And no one takes it seriously now. But like, they used to try to say that, that blacks had like smaller brains than everybody else. And they basically were trying to dehumanize the blacks, which is, they were probably doing that to try to appeal to their conscience, or to like sort of lessen the reality of like, we're killing these people and we own them and we're basically torturing them.
To soothe their conscience. So I'm sure some people had to, but anyway.
This seems like a very different situation.
This is him appealing to take what was a runaway slave back as a human brother, as his own brother, to receive him in the church, and now he's a useful brother in Christ, and basically like he still owes you a debt, and he ran out on you, but I'm asking you to forgive it. So it's like he could have just said, love him and be a kind master and take him back and don't charge him, don't like let him out of jail, but instead he said wipe his debt clean, which it takes it a step further. So the fact that people use verses like these from the New Testament to condone U.S., human trafficking, basically slavery, is totally inappropriate and a misuse of the Bible.
Okay, and also, when people are like, well, like the question, why doesn't Paul condemn slavery? Okay. So 1 Corinthians 7, I'll start at 19. So Paul's talking to a bunch of different types of people, the church in Corinth, and he's basically, it seems like he's responding to a question. We don't know what their letter to him said, so all we can do is try to guess based on his response. But it sounds like the church in Corinth was probably made up of a bunch of different types of people from all different backgrounds. And so Paul's
Getting wild.
Huh?
Getting wild.
Yeah, and so Paul's addressing different types of people. So he says, circumcision does not matter and uncircumcision does not matter, but keeping God's commandments does. Each person should remain in the life situation in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? It should not be a concern to you. But if you can become free, by all means take the opportunity. For he who is called by the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called as a free man is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each person should remain with God in whatever situation he was called. So he's talking to some Jews there, some Gentiles, because some Gentiles were like, should I get circumcised? What would please God more? Paul's basically saying, like, you can please God in whatever situation you're in.
Yeah.
But to slaves, if you can gain your freedom, do so.
Yeah.
So Paul's acknowledging the fact that slavery is not an ideal situation. And he probably didn't outright condemn it. Again, it was probably not what we think of when we think of slavery.
Right. Yeah. And in some cases, it was like a way for people to get out of poverty. If the ideal way, like for a God-honoring Jew, to take a man in for 7 years and then to give him tons of stuff to get his life started, if that's like the ideal, like what if you're obeying God, what you're doing, then yeah. Anyways,
exactly.
So our next question comes from Chris Curtinitis. Says, we might not get through all this. There's a lot of questions packed into one, but what is our responsibility to the government? In America, are we the people the government? Are we obliged to obey a government person if they are abusing their power? If two governing authorities demand opposing actions, to whom do we submit? I think there in the last part he's talking about state versus federal.
Okay.
But Yeah. Do we first off? Is it our responsibility to obey a government if they're abusing their power?
Yes. Yes. I think, and I think there's a bit. I think you asked him some other questions to try to figure out kind of what he was getting at. But
As far as the two governing authorities opposing each other, yeah, that's where I figured out he meant kind of a state versus federal.
But wasn't he talking about gun ownership?
Yeah, there was like an issue in Virginia. I think you probably know more than me about.
Okay, so back to what I was saying. As far as like, should we obey the government? Yes. The only time I think that it's okay for a Christian to just blatantly disobey the government is if they are trying to enforce something that would make us go against our conscience in regards to serving Jesus.
Yeah.
I think that's the only time. Like, so like the situations I can think of are like a mark of the beast type situation where it's like you have to take this mark and in doing so deny Jesus or you'll be put to death. It's like, well, then cut my head off because I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
That's when you disobey the government.
Right, or if the government asks you to help kill somebody, even if it's not like the government's like, don't preach Jesus, like they did to Peter and John, and Peter's like, we have to obey God rather than you. Like, what are you talking about?
Or if like, I don't see this happening, but I don't know, crazier things have happened. If the government somehow says that pastors are legally obligated to perform gay wedding ceremonies,
or not preach on that or something.
Yeah, which they do in Canada. So in Canada, it's hate speech to say homosexuality is a sin. So like apart from those things, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, we have to obey the government.
So Romans 13:1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." And quick side note, it doesn't say the king or the Constitution. It just says the governing authorities, like the current governing authorities. You can't like lift up the Constitution and say, well, that's my government, so I can disobey the current government. It's like, I think we all know what this is talking about. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment.
Boom.
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a camp of people out there that think that, like, America is the world's, like, God's gift to the world. It's like the Christian nation, and we have to uphold it no matter what. And so if we disobey the government to, like, uphold the Constitution or get America back to what it was before or something like that, these are all based on A, misunderstandings of history, and B, like, they still are you're disobeying that verse if you disobey the government in many ways.
I agree with you, but I will say, so something, I think protesting is a different situation because we're allowed to protest.
Right.
And also, protesting isn't disobeying. It's basically people saying, I don't like this, change it.
Yeah, and we exist in a democracy.
Yeah, so I think just to touch a bit on the rioting that's going on, I think there's a lot of laws that are racist that are set up against black people. Some of the drug laws, where, like, I forgot the exact amounts, but, like, it's a felony to have, like, an ounce of crack cocaine, but you have to have, like, 10 ounces of regular cocaine. So, like, if you have crack cocaine, it's a heftier fine and penalty than if it's just regular cocaine.
Okay.
And the reason is because back during the 80s and the crack epidemic, it was mainly black communities that were affected by crack cocaine, because crack cocaine is a lot cheaper, and
so what you're saying is that in essence they made the cheaper thing that has already made its way into the black community more punishable by harsher prison sentences.
Yeah, correct. And I think it's a minimum. I think it was a minimum of 7 years in federal prison if you're caught with it. And it's like there's a lot of laws and stuff.
Did you know that in the 13th Amendment, I've never actually read this before, but somebody told me this today. In the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, there's a clause in it that says, unless you're talking about prison, there to make people work for you for nothing is okay.
Yeah.
And then like you suddenly have all these laws which basically seem to be subtly like aimed at the black community.
Right.
It's kind of at the same time it's
I don't even think it's I think it's just a fact.
Really?
I think it's so evil that people want to say it's a conspiracy. Some people,
because it seems so out there that the government would do that.
Yeah, but also there's a reason there's a bunch of angry people in the streets right now.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's mainly not white people in the streets
that
are mad because the laws don't really affect us the same way. With that,
in answering this question 100%, I don't think we are at all trying to say you can't protest. But
what I'm saying,
the question asker was asking more about, can you outright disobey the government? And protesting is not disobedience.
Right. I think rioting is.
Right.
I think as Christians, we need to realize that Christianity was illegal in Rome at a certain point, and so the laws against Christians were way harsher than anything anyone's facing in the United States right now.
Not to mention it was an occupying authority. Like if any place is God's gift to the world, it's Israel. And if anyone has a justification for saying, get out of my country, you non-believing government, it's Israel. Right. And that's exactly what they had. And they tried to get Jesus to be that Messiah. And he unequivocally, sloughed that off and said, that's not why I'm here. Yeah. And by the way, pay taxes, even.
Right. I mean, he will be that.
Right.
Eventually, that is part of
second coming,
the fulfillment of him being the Messiah.
Yeah.
But my point is, and I think part of Chris's question is regarding guns, like gun ownership and stuff. Here's what I'll say.
Because of the state versus Fed thing?
Yeah. Just to give some backstory of that. So the federal government, in a lot of ways, supersedes the state government. So in certain states, you can have like machine guns and silencers and stuff like that, like crazy weapons and stuff. But the federal government are the people that would be the ones to ban all firearms. So like a state can prohibit ownership of certain guns, but the federal government, they're the ones that kind of have the final say on things.
So if the state said it was okay to own guns and the federal government said we're banning all guns, you're saying the federal government wins that battle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then the question is like, do we as the state, even if our governor says, I want everybody in our state to take up arms against the federal government.
Yeah, which we would lose. If they
Yeah.
I mean, the federal that's the government.
Yeah.
That's the military and stuff. But I love guns. I support the Second Amendment. I like guns. I think if you can own a gun, you should. I think there's many benefits to owning a gun. But with that said, it's kind of hard to, I don't know, if it becomes illegal to own a firearm, it's like, as a Christian, are we supposed to obey that law? or not? Or are we justified in breaking the law? I want to say break the law.
Right.
That's what I want, because I think it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
I think we should have the right to own guns. But, I don't know. I don't know about that one.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for me, I would say it's not, it's like an amoral, non-biblical issue. So I feel like you should submit to the government.
Mm-hmm.
Not that like the Christian right would love that answer, but that's how I feel.
Yeah.
I also haven't looked into it a ton, but what I think is, if you are prone to cowardice, like let's say you are naturally, you lean more towards like whatever somebody above me says, like I'm just gonna do, like if that's your weakness,
mm-hmm.
then I think when thinking through issues like this, you have to consider that and pray, read the Bible with that in mind, thinking I'm naturally predisposed to being kind of a coward when confronted by authority. So what really should I do, God? Like, help me to understand. And if you are naturally a rebel and you just love, like, you would love the idea of taking up arms against the government or, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If you're naturally kind of a rebel, I think you do have to come to the Word of God and to prayer because all of these things it's shades of gray.
Yeah.
And so should we disobey it's not always going to be clear cut, like stamp on this picture of Jesus, like in Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's clear. Stop preaching the gospel. No, I'm not going to do that. That's
Did they
clear.
say to do that in Japan?
Yeah. Back in the day.
Really?
Yeah. And so, but when it's in shades of gray, I think you have to go by your conscience, and you have to go by the Word of God. You have to go by asking God what you should do and asking for wisdom, believing that He'll give it to you, and understand what your predisposed weakness is. Are you a rebel at heart and you are kind of like, have an itchy trigger finger? Or are you a coward? I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. Neither one's worse than the other. But you know what I'm saying.
I know what you mean. I agree. I mean, I fall on the side of I hate authority.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Yeah.
Like if you tell me not to do something, that's exactly the thing I want to do.
Right, and I'm kind of the same way. Yeah.
And so with stuff like, especially with stuff I like,
mm-hmm.
it's like if the government
double whammy.
Yeah, if the government's like
Twinkies.
you can't do this now, I'm going to be like, watch me do it and watch me get away with it.
The government says you can't have Marie Callender pies. I'm taking up arms.
I'm going to start bootlegging pie.
Yeah. At that point, it's okay.
Yeah. I'll build a pie still in the woods.
Yeah.
And I'll trick out a Model T car.
Yeah.
And I'll have a sawed-off
Tommy gun.
I'll become Jimmy Dillinger.
We thought maybe it'd be a good time to have Dave share his testimony. You can give like the short version, but
okay. I've kind of mentioned some of my my backstory before, mainly the part about being gay. What? But I guess a quick overview testimony. So I was born in Seattle, Washington on June 9th, 1986 to Kevin and Bonnie Pendris. So my family moved to Des Moines in 95, and I was raised Pentecostal. Hallelujah. We went to First Assembly of God on Merle Hay Road. And that's kind of my growing up church experience.
You cut your teeth.
Cut my teeth on heresy. Just kidding. JK. So that's kind of my church background. We also my parents were big into like faith healers. So like Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn came to Des Moines in the late 90s. He was at Wells Fargo Arena, and we went and saw Benny Hinn, and I got to watch them push all the actually sick people to the back and usher up all the... There was one lady, not to go off on a tangent, there was one lady that went up there because she was fat, and Benny Hinn prayed to God and told her that she was going to lose 100 pounds in 90 days.
Did she? Like thinner, like that Stephen King novel?
Yeah, exactly.
He fed her one of those.
And I just remember
pies.
thinking, like, if only it worked like that. If only that were true.
You immediately got up and went on stage.
Yeah. So grew up doing that. I was interested in God. I didn't really understand a lot of things about God because it was all through the lens of the spiritual gifts.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was little, I used to speak in tongues. I started speaking in tongues when I was little. I stopped probably around 18. Shortly after that, my family just kind of left that church. And so for a long time, I thought I was a Christian because I liked the idea of God and stuff like that. I came out as gay to my parents when I was 18. So right when I was moving, so I moved out of my parents' house and moved in with some guys from the church. The older I got, I just started to get more bitter and stuff. I didn't know how to deal with my sexuality, and so I just became really bitter about being gay, and also a lot of other I had some traumatic things happen to me, and which I basically had PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't diagnosed with that at the time. I am now, but so I started having really bad depression and panic attacks and stuff. That's kind of when I started going to the doctor and getting on medicine and stuff, and that kind of led to drug addiction and just more bitterness. And so basically, I left the church when I was 24. I decided that I just wanted to live however I wanted. I wanted a boyfriend, eventually a husband, and so I did that, and I just basically started partying. I had a few ups and downs. It's at some point or at various points I would kind of try to go back to God, and then I would decide it wasn't working for me, and I would, leave again. About 4 years ago, I moved out to Louisville, Kentucky, and I was a director and a writer at a production company, and I got to work with some famous people. I worked with Michael W. Smith, and
did one of his songs save you?
No. But I was in one of his music videos. If you go to YouTube and look up "A Million Lights" by Michael W. Smith, I'm in that music video. Fun fact. And I worked on a movie with the comedian Mark Maron, and I got to do some really cool stuff. Me and the guy I was working with at the production company, it was a kind of a messed up situation, and I ended up leaving Kentucky, and I went to rehab. So I quit that job. I went to rehab for a few months in Florida, and then came back to Des Moines. And I had basically lost everything. I didn't really have any money anymore. And the only stuff I had was whatever I could fit in my car. I started getting more interested in God again and stuff. And one day on October 20th of 2019, I was listening to a John Piper sermon, and it just sort of clicked for me in a way that it hadn't before. The gospel and forgiveness and my sin and everything. And that's when I was born again. So the reason I'm sharing my testimony again is because I have not yet been baptized.
What?
Yeah. Mainly because I wasn't part of a church.
Right.
I mean, I'm still not a member of a church, but
kind of hard to be right now.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to be. So I just didn't really have a way to get baptized.
Yeah.
And we are commanded to be baptized. Jesus was baptized. And so I love Jesus, and I want to do all the things that he did. So shortly after we record this, I'm going to get baptized.
Get saved for the first time.
Yep.
Just kidding.
I'm going to have all my sin washed away.
I don't want to add to your testimony or anything.
Then don't.
But no, I just want to say that you getting saved was, like, for me, as wild as people must have thought Paul getting saved was in the New Testament.
Really?
Just because it's not because you were breathing out threats and killing women and children who were Christians or anything like that, but it was because you just seemed so angry and far off. And I don't know, I felt like for the longest time, like I lost my best friend, and it was just really hard to have you gone. And it felt like I at times even gave up, like, praying, and then God saved you, and it was just the wildest thing. And I told people, like, all bets are off. If you think somebody, like, can't get saved, like, or God doesn't hear your prayers, like, that's not true. He does. And I mean, I'm not the only one who's praying for you, obviously, but it's crazy to have you in my life again. It's crazy because when you were gone, I just would think about our friendship and, like, remember it so fondly, even though there was, like, pain. And yeah, I don't know, it's just crazy to have you back.
Yeah.
And I
mean, I'm glad to be back.
Care about you. So anyways, let's do a last question. We can wrap this up.
Okay.
Let's do a quick one. No big deal.
Whatever.
So this is from Allie Crummy. It's not going to be a quick one, but we'll do our best. MLK said that the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. Is that true still today? Does God want it to be that way?
Martin Luther King Jr. said that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour.
Yeah, so the church hour, the hour that you're in church. Basically, there's white church and there's black church. And does God want it to be that way? Is it still that way today? So you know a little bit about the history of this?
I know a little bit. So, I mean, the quick answer, no, God doesn't want it to be this way.
And that's
yes, the church is very much segregated. I think it's difficult because I think all of the people that would say that they don't think that's the case are probably white people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it doesn't really affect us in the same way. So we would think, well, everything's fine, but there's still black church. And if you ever wonder, like, isn't it weird if we're all Christians, why are we segregated? Why is black and white church a thing? There's a history of racism in certain denominations. I know that the Presbyterian Church, the PCA, which is now a good denomination, Tim Keller is a member of the PCA. Back in the day, I think they were kind of against integration.
Mm-hmm.
They were kind of on the wrong side of that argument. And so there are some legitimate reasons that maybe black people wouldn't want to go to white people church. I think I think because it's been that way for so long that black church and white church, culturally, they're very different.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think people are opposed to things that are not familiar to them.
Yeah.
And I think that has something to do with it. And unless there's like a concerted effort among Christians to reach out to each other, because I don't think it's just a white church thing. I think it's both. I think we need to come together as brothers and sisters and probably try to do something about that. But until that happens, I don't think it'll change.
Yeah, it's tough because there was a pastor. I was talking to my friend Hannah today, and she said that she was listening to a pastor talk about how he intentionally is a pastor at a predominantly white church, and he says that every single time he's there, it feels like it's hard and it's countercultural. It's like he's doing cross-cultural ministry at his own church every single week because it's just different than the way he would naturally do church. And it would be the same way if like I went to a predominantly black church, and it would be a very different experience there than it is at the church I go to. And so, yeah, I think the reality is that we reach out to people who are in our same socioeconomic phase of life in our circles. Like, even if your church has good intentions, they know how to share the gospel, they believe that God created all men equally, and they're not racist apart from, you know, maybe blind spots or whatever, but they are good intentions still. Like, if everybody in your church, you know, they're 20 somethings, they're young and cool, but then they get married and they move out to the suburbs, it's like, if you're going to reach out to your neighbors, you're going to reach all white people in the white suburb that you moved into. So why are you surprised when you look around and you see nothing but white people? It's like, well, that's who you've been reaching out to. And I'm not saying that's always the case. I'm a part of a Bible study right now that reaches out to predominantly non-white people. It's a cross-cultural, like, trying to reach refugees and stuff Bible study. And what's crazy is it's the most ethnically diverse Bible study I've ever been a part of. And I don't think it's an accident. I think because we're trying to reach non-white people, it attracts people of color and of different backgrounds. And I just think it's important when you're choosing where to do ministry, where to reach out to people, how to organize Bible studies. If you're a pastor, where people should be reaching out to, you've got to consider that. You've got to consider having not everybody, but definitely teams of people who reach out to different areas than just the white suburb, you know, and maybe even move to those areas. Show people that you are really willing to cross cultures, not just invite them to church and make them conform to everything you are, but, you know, try to really get into their world. That's what Jesus did. He didn't, you know, stay in the nice part of town and invite all the unfortunates over to him. He went into them.
Yeah.
And
so that's, I think, really difficult to do that.
Right.
Because, I mean, I'm a super introverted person. Mm-hmm. And so, like,
right.
That's like I mean, I understand not wanting to do that because it's really uncomfortable.
Right. And it's definitely not like the white people only live in the suburbs and people of color only live in the ghetto or something. I'm not trying to say that, but especially when considering refugees, obviously they live in more impoverished nations. As far as, you know, in a lot of places in our country, black people live in certain neighborhoods and white people live in certain neighborhoods, and there's some crossover, but not a lot. And many refugees tell us that they've never been in a white person's home ever. And so, yeah, whether it's crossing class lines or race lines or social lines, culture lines, we've got to do that. And it's never just going to be like, the church is divided by race, what do we do? It's like you go to them, you know. Yeah. I think that's what you do. And the more diverse your church gets, I think the more it represents the real body of Christ and what heaven will be like. So
yeah. I mean, I don't know all the answers really of how to get rid of segregation in the church. I think it probably grieves God that it's that way. Mm-hmm. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but basically what I'm saying is racism's bad.
It's bad. Don't do it.
Don't do racism.
We're never going to tackle these topics the way we should, and we're not pastors, we're not experts, we're just dudes. And if you're listening to this podcast, we don't know why, but don't take everything we say super seriously. We just open our mouths and stuff comes out. Mm-hmm. But we love you guys, and if you ordered a t-shirt, they'll be there soon. Otherwise, check us out on Instagram and Facebook. And David P., what do you have to say?
If you have questions, comments, concerns, let us know on Facebook, or if you have our phone numbers, leave us alone.
Just kidding.
Don't call or text us.
All right.
I think that's it.
All right, we love you.
All right, bye.